My name is Darren Hicks. I'm with the DU Faculty Senate, and it's my honor to moderate today's event, Rising Tides of Hate, a panel discussion and conversation. While this panel was certainly catalyzed by recent events, the horrific attacks in Pittsburgh, Jefferstown, Orlando, and Charleston, as well as the terrifying proliferation of hateful rhetoric in our national political discourse and even here on campus, it's important to remember that these events have deep roots and wide international effects. And our panelists have spent their careers working to understand what motivates hate and developing ways to combat it. To put today's conversation into context, the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism reports that the number of hate crimes compiled from 38 major U.S. cities increased 12% over 2016 to 2017, with 55% of those hate crimes being motivated by anti-Jewish hatred and 25% by anti-Muslim hatred. And here in Denver, the number of hate crimes has increased at an alarming 74%. In a powerful editorial published last week in the Denver Post, our panelists write that, quote, there is a deep danger in the additive logic of hatred, and that people who hate one group of people for their ethnic, religious, racial, sexual, or other identities tend to hate other groups as well. They conclude the editorial by noting that this hatred is and has always been fueled by ignorance, suspicion, and fear, and remind us that it's through our research, teaching, and community partnerships that the university has emerged as the most powerful institution we know for overcoming this fear, dispelling that ignorance, and transforming hate. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Nader Hashemi, the director for the Center for Middle East Studies, Tom Romero, the Assistant Provost for Inclusive Excellence Research and Curriculum Initiatives, Andrea Stanton, the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies, and Sarah Pessin, Interfaith Chair and Director, Center for Judaic Studies. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Our country is in deep peril. Events last week cast a spotlight on the profound crisis that we're facing. The week began in Kentucky when a man with a gun tried to enter an African-American church. The door was locked, so he went to a nearby grocery store where he murdered 2 African-Americans in what is widely believed to be a hate crime. Around the same time, police foiled a domestic terrorist attack after 15 pipe bombs were mailed to the homes of prominent personalities associated with the Democratic Party. News of this event dominated headlines for several days. And then, of course, the week ended with a horrific massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that killed 11 people. This was the worst anti-Semitic attack in American history. The common denominator that links all 3 of these events is the figure of Donald Trump. Trump didn't pull the trigger, but he did prep the shooter. He set the stage for these acts of violence. And we are facing rising tides of hatred in this country for many reasons, but particularly and especially because of Trump's constant, repeated, ongoing, and unrelenting endorsement of hate against minority groups. This hate and fear-mongering has now reached historic heights and which has brought America to a very dark place for which the President of the United States bears unique responsibility. And for some perspective, it was reported yesterday, news came out that even Fox News refused to broadcast a 30-second inflammatory ad because they considered it too inflammatory, too racist, and too bigoted. That gives you and tells you something about the depths of xenophobia and demagoguery and crass bigotry that this president has sunk to. How can we explain what's going on? I think the best analytical framework is to situate this current crisis in the context of the global decline of democracy and the global rise of authoritarianism. Exploiting legitimate political frustrations and economic pain, a charismatic leader emerges who promises to save the people, to return to the glory days of the past, to make the country great again. Enemies are identified and blamed for contemporary social and economic problems. A discourse of victimization and national self-defense is developed that goes something like this. They are contaminating our nation, our race. They are destroying our culture. We must do something about them, or we will perish. And at the end of such an ideological trajectory, something ugly always happens if not stopped, and it can lead to mass violence. We've already seen acts of violence, the three events that I referred to just a moment ago. It's not accidental that Trump has anchored his political campaign precisely in this strategy of xenophobia and fear-mongering. This is straight out of Chapter 2 from the Authoritarian's playbook. All aspiring autocrats play this card to obtain power and then to retain power. So he's anchored his campaign in this alleged threat from this caravan of Latin Americans coming to overwhelm us, and he's thrown in for good measure that amongst them are a group of Middle Easterners. When he was asked, where are they, how do you know this, he denied it, but still he does it for effect. Because 2 years ago at the last presidential election, the exit polls revealed that the two number one motivating factors for people who voted for Trump were number one, immigration, and number two, terrorism. In other words, Mexicans and Muslims. And again, Trump is playing this bigoted card for maximum effect. Let me just end with a historic note about where we are as a country and a call to action. David Rothkopf recently observed that it's not written in stone that the United States of America must always exist. It's not guaranteed that the country that goes by that name will always be a democracy. You cannot take as a given the greatness or strength or stature that we've grown to be accustomed to, that it will always endure. Throughout our history, we've been reminded of the fragility of the American idea and the country that it inspired. We got off to a precarious start with an ill-conceived system. We have seen a civil war and participated in 2 world wars and a Cold War. The American democratic experiment was always imperfect, and it was compromised by a heritage informed by slavery, the dispossession of Native Americans, suppression of basic rights for women, racism, and now well into the 21st century, an economically divided country where the 99% largely work to enrich the 1%. At each of those junctures, though, we've reached deep into the character of the nation and found the fortitude and judgment to correct our course or repulse our enemies. But this fact should not provide us with any comfort, because we only have to fail once for the entire experiment to end. We are at another such juncture in history today. What's at risk is the very idea of America that so many of us grew up with and attracted people from different lands. This is slowly vanishing before our eyes, and I'm not talking about some impossible idea of some flawless nation. Realistic Americans understand that there always have been flaws, gaps, and imperfections that must be attended to, that our greatness is rooted not in perfection, but in our ability to work, to struggle, to perfect ourselves, to correct our errors, and to get better. That's what great countries do. The hard reality is that we find ourselves at a moment when those in high positions of power are ready to defeat our best impulses and serve ideas that will diminish us. Donald Trump, as evidenced by his appalling behavior in the final weeks of this campaign, his lies, his fear-mongering, his racism, his narcissism, his defense of foreign despots, his minimizing of acts of domestic terror, has presented himself with each passing day not just as a failing president or as a profoundly damaged person, but as a threat to the very idea of America as a liberal democracy. And of course, he's been empowered and joined in this endeavor by a Republican Party that has accepted his defects as their own and would do literally anything to achieve a narrow agenda benefiting a small group of special interests. And so we've come to one of those defining moments, those turning points, as we did in the past, in the Civil War or the 2 world wars or the McCarthy era or the era of Jim Crow, where we're being tested again, collectively tested. What is at stake is not just how we are perceived as a country internationally, but whether America as we know it will continue to exist. Don't take anything you have grown used to for granted. Don't take democracy in this country for granted. Don't take progress for granted. Don't assume that the institutions will work to serve us. A democratic republic requires constant attention and devotion by its citizens. All of that now is open to question because of the dangerous man that occupies the White House and the craven cabal that surrounds him. Who can save us? Only we can. How? It's come to take a stand. It's time to take a stand against Trump and all that he represents. Today is, of course, Election Day. I hope you all have voted. If you haven't, you still have time. In 2 more years, there'll be another election. Arguably, it will be the most important election that will shape the destiny of this country. It requires organization, it requires effort, it requires sacrifice. It's not going to be fixed by itself. So let me just end with a story that you might have heard before from Benjamin Franklin. There's a famous story that upon exiting the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, Benjamin Franklin was approached by a group of citizens asking what sort of government had the delegates created. And Franklin responded, "A republic, if we can keep it." Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Speaking to the microphone here. It's an honor to be on this panel here today with such a distinguished group of fellow colleagues here at the University of Denver. It was not mentioned in my bio, but I am also a professor at the College of Law, also an affiliated faculty member in the Department of History. And so what I'm going to hope to do and accomplish today is to give you a little historical perspective into setting up the ways we think about hate, the ways we think about the way it operates in our American democracy. It was an obvious choice to have this conversation today, on the day that we get to really think about and make hard choices about what it means to be a participant in this thing called the American experiment. As a historian, as a legal historian, a social political historian, I always recalled the work of Gary Gersel in his book, The American Crucible. And one of the major points that he makes in that book is that if you look at the arc of American history, from its founding to the present day, we in the United States, and particularly in context of our political elections, we are always at war between two diametrically opposed thoughts. The idea between American civic nationalism and the idea between America's racial nationalism. And this is what has formed the American character. It's one that is not new, and this tension is not new. This battle and this war between racial nationalism and American nationalism is not new. It was embedded in our Constitution. And one of the things I'm hoping to share with you just in my brief comments today is to show some of the ways that has been embedded within racism and fear and hate directed in particular against Latinos. And those that are Spanish surnamed from Latin America that seemingly come from not the United States, right, but all the ways that we can sort of think about the border has been a way to reflect not only and sort of our perceptions of the people on the border, right, who we are as a people, who we are as a nation, but who is also protected as part of that American dream. And I want to do a little bit of that in context of Colorado. So what you see up here is an image that maybe some of you have been thinking about in context of the deployment of over 5,000 troops to the United States border with Mexico. And of course, this is an image, and the militarization of the border, the deployment of troops to the border is not something that is new. It began in the 1920s. It began with the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924. And over the course of time, right, this border has become militarized. It has been, we have seen these walls literally form to shape our ideas about who is and who isn't an American. Now, one of the things that you all might know about or maybe not know about is these questions were taking place here in Colorado back in the 1930s. And they were done in a very political environment. The governor of Colorado at the time, Edwin Johnson, threatened to send out the National Guard to militarize the border. Now, this wasn't the border between the United States and Mexico. It was the border between the United States, and I'll move back here, between Colorado and New Mexico. How many of you ever thought of that as an international border, right? So this, in 1936, Edwin Johnson, start working my way back here. Sorry about that. Edwin Johnson declared martial law in the state of Colorado for only the second time in Colorado's history. And he did it specifically to prevent Mexicans and Mexican Americans from coming into the state of Colorado. And the idea here was that Mexicans and Mexican Americans were coming to Colorado to come on relief roles, right? And so he deploys the National Guard. And I want you to see, these are the sorts of images that begin to appear in the newspaper, the Denver Post, the Rocky Mountain News, right? You see the National Guard getting armed up to be deployed to the border. We see these maps, right? Military maps are being published in the newspapers, right? This is 1936. All to control these people, right? These are the typical people that are coming into Colorado. Most of them are actually American citizens. Most are coming from New Mexico. Most have been born in New Mexico and could trace their families back to prior to Plymouth, right? Those that were from Mexico oftentimes had the required documentation, but they were families. And they were families seeking a better way of life. In fact, there were jobs in the sugar beet fields in northeastern Colorado that many of these families, this declaration of martial law happened in April of 1936, the very beginning of the sugar beet growing season. So these families were basically migrant laborers, right? Agricultural laborers seeking a better way of life and going to work in the sugar beet fields of northeastern Colorado. Now, Governor Johnson was not driven by any sort of, for himself, any particular animus towards Mexicans or Mexican Americans. But he was reading the political climate. Coming out of this, he becomes a senator, a United States senator, and runs a campaign the following fall to become a senator in Colorado. And I want to, hopefully you all can get a sense of what's written on here. But he's being driven by a lot of what comes to be the fear of, as you see up here, the Mexican menace. So this is, I'm going to read very quickly here an excerpt from a letter that Governor Johnson received in 1936 in response to him declaring martial law. There is one way to rid this state and country of them, and that is to pass a bill to sterilize every Mexican on relief who has more than 2 children. There would be a mad scramble to get out of here if such a measure could be enacted, as that is all they think of from childhood to the grave. I am sorry to say they will never make good citizens as long as they go to the Catholic schools and churches. All Mexicans who refuse to work in the beet fields should be cut off from all relief. We have called them entirely too long, and they think they have us bluffed. And of course, as you see up here, this is in direct response to the so-called Mexican menace. This led then to vigilante groups being formed. This flyer started appearing all over southern Colorado, northern Colorado. There were threats against Mexican Americans in particular, but Mexican nationals who were here in Colorado to work in the beet fields. There was a reign of terror, right, that was supported by the militarization by the state. And so I want to leave us here with a couple thoughts. The ways that our immigration law and our immigration policy and the rhetoric in our politics racializes Latinos in particular. Racializes them as non-white, as non-American, as non-citizen, right? The term illegal, right? What that does to dehumanize people, right? Make them a threat. Make them an existential threat to, again, this idea of what the United States is. And of course, the way that we've militarized that, right? The way that it's really become an armed struggle. And we see the consequences of that. What happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue, right? From the media reports, part of it was driven, that what happened in that synagogue was driven by a fear of immigrants coming to the United States, right? An irrational fear of immigrants coming to the United States. So this is part of our long arc of our struggle between racial nationalism and civic nationalism. And today and every day after, we're going to continue to have those battles. Thank you.
So among other things, I was responsible for the slides, and so I apologize for getting yours out of order. I took a sneak peek this morning and learned quite a lot. So I want to make basically 3 points, and to pick up on what Tom was saying, I think we might also add in the way that religious minorities in this country are also racialized. But I want to talk about anti-Muslim sentiment and the ways that since for the past decade it's been a particularly new kind of sentiment with a very political emphasis, and that it connects more recently with the denial of Islam as a religion, and that anti-Muslim sentiment is increasingly being used as a badge of honor. But I just want to start with just a quick reminder of the demographics, that Muslims in the United States are what we might call a super minority. Depending on the statistics you look at, they're 0.9% of the population or a high of 1.1, 1.2% of the population. And what that also means is that many people who are not Muslim also, and American, also don't know anyone who's Muslim or maybe don't know anyone well. And I think that really facilitates the growth and the popularity of a lot of negative assumptions. So let me start by talking about someone who's not Muslim, so that we can look at the political saliency of Muslim as a term. And since 2008, which has also been the era in which we've seen actual Muslims, again, not this guy, who have taken positions in the national political stage. And I'm thinking of Keith Ellison, elected in 2006, Andre Carson after that, Ilhan Omar. Not a large number. I mean, we can name them all. This isn't really a takeover, certainly not a successful takeover, but more than zero, which is what the history of the US national political spectrum shows. What I just want to highlight here is the way that polling since the 2008 election showed not a decrease in the number of people who across the country believed that Obama was Muslim, but an increase. And so if I backed it up further to before the presidential election of 2008, we'd actually see that the number was around 8%. Never zero, which is interesting. If you look at polls of American Muslims, also you see that there's always some percentage of people who also think that Obama is Muslim. Even if you break this down in 2015 by politics, over 40% of people who identify as Republicans thought that Obama was Muslim, but 15% of Democrats did. So there's no category for whom no one thought Obama was Muslim. But what I want to see here is that what to me I see from the increase is that Muslim has become a political label and an accusation in the United States, and that we can see this happening since 2008. This is not something that goes back to the year 1776. This is not something that goes back to World War I or much further in US history. This is quite new. And that I also want to point out that talking about Obama being Muslim and using that as a reason to disparage him or argue against voting for him was described even in 2008 as a displacement for talking about Obama as Black or as African American. And so what I think if we were paying more careful attention in 2008, we would also have seen an increase in the efforts of, or the popularity of white nationalists. And I'm thinking here particularly of sites like Stormfront, which saw a big uptick in posts and at least temporary members around the time of the campaign and the election. A lot of the news in 2008 focused on evangelical Christians as a voting bloc, particularly because of the candidacy of then vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. And I think if we had paid a little less attention to religion and a little more attention to race, we might have had a more keen sense of what was also happening. The second point that I want to make is connected to the first. And this one's also pretty recent. This one starts in 2010. Since then, except for the Robertson quote, which is actually from 2009. So he was a trendsetter. So since then, and specifically since 2010, which saw both the Ground Zero mosque controversy and also a controversy about a proposed mosque in Murfreesboro, we've seen a newer and very different push from more right-wing groups. They aren't arguing that Islam is a bad religion, and they aren't arguing that Islam is a false religion or that it leads people into error and damnation. You can certainly find a lot of that rhetoric, but what we've increasingly seen is the argument that Islam is not a religion at all, that Islam is a political ideology that disguises itself as a religion in order to get First Amendment protections and to be accepted in American society. And so for these people, teaching about Islam as a religion is a threat to American politics and the American political system. This argument would strip Muslims of constitutional constitutional protections and would exclude Islam from all the arguments being made now about religious freedom and its importance. It also sets up some interesting parallels with anti-Semitism, the argument that Muslims follow a non-religion for political purposes coming from outside the United States to try and take us over and using our own freedom to do so. This is a very pernicious argument. What I want to close with is looking at a little bit of a comment on language. The term Islamophobia has become increasingly common in political discourse as a term for hostility toward Muslims and fear of Muslims and Islam. I'm actually not sure that normalizing the term is helpful. I hear people using it and talking about Islamophobia as if it's always been part of American or Western European culture, and it's used sometimes as a way to kind of throw up one's hands and say, yes, this is really horrible, but it's just too bad. It's always been with us, and therefore it will always be with us, and that's just how it is. That's actually not true. Islamophobia as a political project that encourages the fear of Muslims as people with hostile designs on the US and the rest of the free world, using a fake religion to mask their political goals. That's a very new concept. We can certainly find stereotypes about Muslims going back to the 1700s in US political discourse, but nothing like this. But we have a much better chance of addressing it as an issue, I think, if we recognize it as new and if we don't give in to the bad history that says it's been a Euro-American phobia since the year 632. But I think it's also helpful to see where the term is used most frequently. For the past 5 years, the word Islamophobia, if we look at major US news channels, and here I've looked at just CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, and it's appeared most frequently on Fox, by far. More than twice as many times as on CNN, and 1.8 times as often as on MSNBC. This is Television Explorer, which is the product of a Finnish scholar, so not, well, he may have his biases, but they're not necessarily American biases. In any case, it searches word occurrences on various news networks using the closed captioning transcripts. And if we look at related terms like radical Islam or political correctness, Fox News also comes across as the most frequent user. And so I think what I take from that is that this particular network's anchors and commentators have taken the term Islamophobia and put it into a discourse about radical Islam and political correctness. If I were going to use really nerdy terms, I'd say this is linguistic reappropriation, in which a group that considers itself stigmatized takes up a labeling word or phrase seen as negative and externally applied and starts self-consciously referring to itself with that label as a kind of recapturing. And so using the word Islamophobia in the context of a self-consciously anti-politically correct discourse allows news anchors and commentators to suggest that Islamophobia is, like political correctness, an overblown concern of the left, and like being labeled politically incorrect, it should be seen instead as a badge of honor. So I'll leave us with that.
Okay. We are living in a time of danger, not simply because we are witnessing an alarming rise in intertwined hate speech and acts, up to and including the murder of neighbors in a supermarket or in a place of worship, but perhaps more alarmingly because this hatred is getting a wink, a nod, and increasingly even a push from the highest political office in this country, and equally alarming, hate is getting that push from the very surface of the highest political office. It's not even hidden. Whether you voted for Trump or whether you voted against him, I think we need to take seriously the very real dangers of living in a time in which a president addresses the tragedy of a synagogue shooting at a rally and then goes on to make disparaging remarks about Native identities, and then goes on to make disparaging remarks about Latinx invaders, itself as part of a matrix of remarks against Middle Eastern, read Muslim, invaders, itself as part of a narrative arc in which people of color, women, LGBTQIA and transgender people, veterans, and persons with disabilities are made to fight for their human dignity in a way that feels different from even the regular, which is itself an upsetting thing to have to say, from itself different from even the regular racist and homophobic, gender oppressive, native denying, anti-black, anti-brown, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic way our world has long been operating. Some will tell you that the idea that something feels different is not scientific enough to worry about in a public forum. I would like to urge us otherwise, while also being painfully aware that things like driving while black and existing while native and other basic acts of living within a certain set of marginalized identities have been far exceeding any regular measures of oppression for quite some time. Perhaps, in other words, things feel different now to only some of us in this room who have been fortunate enough either to have no marginalized identities under assault in this country in their lifetime, or to have marginalized identities that have been subjected to only regular, not excessive measures of hostility in their lifetimes in this country. Perhaps when I say that it feels different in this country, I clumsily mean to allude to at least three things that are happening. One, more of our marginalized identities are becoming subject to overt hostilities. Two, the levels of those overt hostilities are exceeding the regular levels of hostility for more of us, mindful again that some of us have been subjected to unspeakably cruel levels of hostility invisible to many of us since the inception of this country. And three, the hostility directed to more of us and with higher than tolerable levels for more of us, which is again a shameful thing to have to say, are explicit and endorsed, not hidden and not discouraged. Not hidden and not discouraged by our president, not hidden and not discouraged by an alarmingly increasing number of our neighbors, and not hidden and not discouraged by an alarmingly unstoppable new wave of anonymous and powerful online and electronic forms of community building as hate building. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber offers a teaching that for some reason continues to stand out to me in thinking about recent events, even though it's not quite on point on its surface. Buber notes that if someone tells you they love God, but they act poorly to the humans around them, then you will know that they do not love God. For some reason, the particular structure of this teaching has been haunting me for days and has taken the following form in my mind. If someone tells you that they are sorry that 11 Jews were gunned down and then goes on to assail the dignity of minoritized people, then you know that they do not care at all for any minoritized people. But of course, this is not just about one dangerous man. This is about a structure of marginalization, a structure of power in which those who are at the margin are silenced either directly, for example, when praying while black or praying while Jewish, or indirectly, as when people, including many of us in the room today, assume that anti-Semitism is no longer a major issue. I think it is true to say that in America, at least in recent decades, Jews mostly pass, or at least to say not all of us, but some of us, even if perhaps only in some contexts more than others, pass. And so many of us in this room and many of our students and colleagues and neighbors assume that anti-Semitism is not a thing anymore. Whether it's the appearance of anti-Semitic Jewish rat graffiti sprayed onto the city sidewalks in Washington, D.C. in 2016, the haunting chant of "Jews will not replace us" during the white nationalist marches on Charlottesville in 2017, or the murder of 11 people in a synagogue just a few days ago, we know today that 55% of all U.S. hate crimes are motivated by anti-Jewish hatred. The Anti-Defamation League also reports that anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. went up 57% in 1 year, and the 2016 FBI hate crime report reminds us that of all hate crimes categorized as religious in nature, 54.2% were motivated by anti-Jewish hatred. To share in honesty, it is alarming to me to see Judaism often left out of student and community coalitions. And this is alarming to me for two opposite reasons. On the one hand, I fear that some of my Jewish students and community partners, perhaps because they have passed within their own lifetimes, are not as fully attuned to the inequities of the American system as some of their peers from other minoritized communities are. For those Jews who do not feel the searing pain of the margin, and to be sure there are many who do, I would ask them to think with vulnerability and care about the responsibilities that come with passing, and in particular, the responsibilities of working tirelessly for those at the margin if one is fortunate enough to not feel oneself or find oneself at that margin. On the other hand, I fear that sometimes when people from other marginalized communities come together, there is a way of leaving out the Jew. I witnessed this firsthand a few years ago when, after weeks of interfaith efforts and reaching out to student groups from multiple backgrounds, I was intentionally left out of a faculty-student healing circle because some students felt that my being a Jew would mean that I would bring certain oppressive anti-Muslim views into the circle. This is one of the most painful things that has happened to me as a human, and it happened to me on this campus when stereotypes about Jews kept me from a healing circle. I was in this regard heartened to see the campus Hillel in solidarity with so many student groups this Friday at the Rally Against Hate. Ironically, perhaps the current climate of excessive and multi-armed racisms and hatreds can help wake us all to realize the dangers before us and the life and death need for us to band together in solidarity, in excessive solidarity that is even more than the regular solidarity of normal times. In his deranged shooting, the synagogue killer did alas show us a logic. He hates Jews because many of them find in their religion a call to help refugees and immigrants, and he hates refugees, immigrants, and Jews because they are not white and because they threaten his power as a white. Let us be more fluid and more open than ever, regardless of whether you lean more to the right or to the left. And even if you are a non-Jew who does not often think of the Jew as a solidarity partner, and even if you're a Jew who doesn't tend to like linking anti-Semitism to anti-Latinx, anti-Native, anti-Black, and Islamophobic hatreds, leave those details aside. Band together with an urgency that is excessive and that is not normal, even if it leaves you feeling uncomfortable, and even if it means you might be arm in arm with someone who does not quite see eye to eye with you on a lot of things. Embrace and march together in a new, creative, and uncomfortable ranks with an evangelical person who will not join you in some of your activisms, a Jewish person who will not join you in some of your activisms, and a Muslim person who will not join you in some of your activisms. Do not allow yourself to only partner against hatred with people in your immediate group or with people who affirm every aspect of your complex, beautifully intersectionally diverse being. We need to learn to link arms even with people who don't affirm everything about ourselves, even with people with whom we might not want to grab lunch. We need to find all the others who are against the unhinged hatreds growing in this country, and we need to learn to work responsibly with one another, even if we do not feel like being friends. Responsibility exceeds friendship. Get more uncomfortable with the people you band together with. In times of danger, uncomfortable allies work together in responsibility and justice to stem the tides of hate and to come together as a large, bulky, pluralist, and messy band of brothers and sisters, not necessarily friends who see eye to eye, to protect one another and to work now with an energy we have seen never before to make this country great, or at least not oppressive, for the first time. To work as a band of brothers and sisters to dismantle systems of oppression that are, make no mistake, spreading like a deadly mold, but whose basic parameters have, make no mistake, firmly been in place for centuries for many of our neighbors in this country. It is time to come together in a new way, in an excessive way, in a way that speaks to Jewish post-Holocaust philosopher Emmanuel Levinas' interpretation of the biblical call of Hineni, here I am, exclaimed in the Bible by Moses and Abraham and others when God calls upon them for a most serious charge. Here I am for Levinas. It's not a matter of God calling us in service, but of our neighbors, each of them calling us into service, and of our standing before them and responding. Here I am. Here I am. Let us find those words at the core of our hearts, bodies, and minds as we pull together, sometimes in friendship and sometimes only in responsibility, which is more important than friendship for the task at hand. Let's all pull together now in renewed, excessive response to ensure equity, safety, and dignity to all of the others dedicated to this same fight against racism, this same fight against oppression. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very powerful. I'd like to open it up now for questions and comments. It's a hard place to come down, so if you could just stand where you are, we have a microphone that we can run to you. Would anyone like to start us off? Okay. Well, while you're thinking, let me do that. One of the common themes among all of the panelists was the role, and one I think about a lot because I'm a rhetorician, is the role of language, the politics of language, the politicization of language. How do we effectively combat hate and in a way that squares with a robust commitment to free expression? And I'd like to hear any thoughts on that.
Nader's calling on me because I always talk first. So, I mean, I'm not a lawyer or a legal scholar, Tom, but for me, I think actually, when I think about language, I don't think of it in terms of the debate over freedom of expression, which I think right now has also been highly politicized. And I think that the terms freedom of expression are sometimes used without having a very careful understanding of what that means, either historically or contemporarily. But I actually think that the words that we use really matter. And so when I think about it, I'm also secretly a historian, so I also would like to drag you back into the past before we get to the present. But I think that for me, one of the challenges is that by recognizing both that changing the words we use is profoundly important, and also that it doesn't create change overnight, and that in my view, as much as I would like to and tend to take a fairly positive view and a progressive improvement view of human history, I don't think that there are quick fixes for the world we live in right now. And so I am concerned about language. I'm very concerned about the words that are being used to describe others. I'm concerned about also the idea in the United States that we just describe ourselves as polarized and leave it at that. That to me is another way of throwing up our hands and saying, well, that's just too bad. It's a pity we live that way, but we're just stuck that way. It's going to be that. That's how it is. But I think we also have to recognize that if language really is significant, then changing that takes time, because changing the words we use is also about changing hearts and minds.
I'll just say a couple of thoughts. I think that I certainly don't have a full answer to this, and it's something with which I wrestle. So this is just sort of some initial or just some thoughts that I have, but I certainly understand the dangers in a pluralist civic space of sort of clamping down on freedom of speech in ways that can result in serious problems, especially given our the pluralist world in which we live, or democracy in which we live in this country, and that goes in a way to sort of my concern with our sort of overly I want to say, sort of immature sense that everyone needs to be our friend. That Okay.
It's divine.
I think that was saying that's good, right? Not everybody wants to be our friend. I'll have to interpret that later. Okay, as with most good things, they could be interpreted in any way that we would like, so I'll go with that. But related to my concern about sort of our civic mood of generally, in our best moments, we want to be friends with people. And again, obviously friendship is important. My concern is that it's not an appropriate civic strategy, and that there are ways in which we need to band together with people whose ideas we don't love. That said, we don't need to band together with Nazis or members of the KKK. So I guess what I'm saying is there has to be certain parameters drawn between the people who get us and who are on board with us and who are like really on board with our specific intersectional identities and expressions. That is one important group of people civically. There's also groups that are important for non-civic reasons, but civically, there's at least 3 groups, and I just sort of, it makes me think of that, and it's related to like the different kinds of speech that maybe go on in the different groups. So on the one hand, there's a group of the people who think very much like me and who identify very much like many of my intersectionalities, and maybe there's a few intersectionalities which are different, but ultimately we speak the same language. On the other hand, there are people like who are advocating for certain kinds of views, racist views, homophobic views, for which we as a society have to create barriers to say, at a certain point, this is not part of the table. We don't get to debate the pros and cons of slavery, as happened a few months back in a classroom. That's no longer part of this particular civic project. So if that's something you're interested in debating, maybe you should find another country. And that, I don't want to say that that's not a hard thing, because that's saying on the one hand there needs to be, of course there needs to be an ability to speak, and again, the middle point is there needs to be enough of an ability to speak so that you can and should be offended daily by all kinds of things that the people sitting next to you believe. But that's a third category. So category 1, the people who think just like you, who are likely to never say anything to offend you. Category 2, people who offend you, who should not be part of the civic discussion and for whom we need to find ways to limit their voices, because again, we've passed the point in this country where we accept a debate about is racism we've passed that. That's not part of this civic project. But in the middle, that's where the hard part is, and I don't think we do yet a good enough job, because I think we only think about those 2 categories, is we need, especially in a time when we need to band together against that third group, we need to get past the idea that if someone thinks that Jews are going to hell, then I'm never going to talk to them civically. I don't need to invite that person to my house, so that's back to my concern. Not everyone needs to be friends. But if this is a good person whose particular version of Christianity has me going to hell, we don't need to talk about that, but we do need to civically work together to fight that third group. So again, that's just sort of some of the things it makes me think about.
Go ahead. I think Andrea prompted me to think about some of the role that the rule of law plays. And I want to start in form thinking about the importance of us being in a moment, like we are in many other moments, as I talked about in the struggle between civic nationalism and racial nationalism that's at the heart of the American project. What we the people means, right, is sort of in our founding document that's supposed to be a cohesive sort of structure, right, in which we can all engage and think about and be part of. So I'm going to go off form a little bit and suggest that maybe one of the things, and this is particularly for the young people in the room, one of the things that I think as part of this conversation, and as we think about this founding document, as we think of the past, is the way that the younger generations, other forms of discourse have pointed us to ways that we can reimagine the past and claim it for our future. So I think of Lin-Miranda Emanuel, right, and Hamilton, right? And anybody who hasn't seen that play, I wonder, for those of you that have seen it, but those of you that haven't seen it, what is it like to see a black George Washington, right? What is it to reimagine the role of immigrants, right, as core people in the founding of an American democracy? What does it mean when one of the things that's part of that play is you can't resolve this thing called slavery, right? So part of the struggle we're in, making America great again, is not going back to the past, but it's reimagining a very, very different future. And we see that happening in art. We see that happening with our young people that are living much more diverse lives, that are much more willing to deal in fluidity and boundaries, and to transverse boundaries and to question boundaries. And I think that's part of the answer of where we go.
I'm going to give my time to the audience. So we have a question right here.
Well, it's a comment on this very subject, and I apologize for getting here late, and I just want to say that I strongly agree with the tone, particularly of Sarah's remarks. When you have people come into a synagogue and murder 11 people, or some white guy who believes the words of Donald Trump shows up and murders 2 elderly black people at a Kroger's because he couldn't get into a church, I'm afraid that that level of violence to the right to life, not just liberty and the pursuit of happiness, overrides freedom of speech. It is not acceptable to shout fire in a crowded theater, and despite an American misunderstanding of freedom of speech, when the Nazis are on the march and killing people, one should be very careful about saying, you know, I really want an enthusiastic speaker about how women really need to remain in the home and cooking and worshiping and producing children for the master race, and all forms of genderlessness, and those are Putin's words, the last one, have to be destroyed. We are actually dealing with a form of fascism, and the term white nationalism doesn't get it. It's a term of identitarian art borrowed by Nazis to make them seem to fit in with the folks they lynched. In other words, black people have a history of being lynched here, and if some people don't like white people, that's very unfortunate, but it is a reaction to something real. These people mean nationalism, supremacy, we're going to lynch you. That's why I say supremacy is the appropriate word in the term of art adopted by the mainstream media as false. I think this has to be taken very, very seriously. And while I am a Jew who is very sensitive to the cause of the Palestinians, and I really don't like Netanyahu, and his son is as big an enemy of George Soros and praised by David Duke for a Facebook page as a real bro, and you can find that in Haaretz last year, and it's worth looking at Yair Netanyahu's Facebook page and realizing that if you want to stand with everyone and not be mowed down for going to a synagogue or a church, better see Nazism clearly and the limits on freedom of speech clearly.
Anyone else?
Thank you. You know, it's interesting listening today, and I mean, we're all in this room, we all agree with a lot of the comments made. But what I see that's common in this room, as opposed to people that don't think like this, is I see fear, which leads to anger, which leads to hatred. And I think we have to look at ourselves as well. I mean, I think we're all broken people on, you know, and I don't want to say on both sides, I don't even want to go there. But I think we have to look at the other side as being broken people, and they need to be fixed. I mean, but they are hurting and they're fearful, and I don't see anything that we're doing to resolve that. And we have to come and communicate rather than say it's us against them. It is, but I think there's another way, because we're going in a circle. We keep on going back and coming up with the same solution, which is nothing.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the amazing panel and great words spoken. My name is Alfredo. I'm a postdoc here, IRISE postdoc here at DU. I'm from LA. You know, I was really intrigued by the panel, and you all brought up a lot of great points. But I wanted to bring in some words from a civil rights leader that kind of overlap the previous two, or you know, touch on some of the aspects that the two previous commenters mentioned. And there's this interview with Ruby Sells, a civil rights leader, in which she was talking about the importance of public theologies, right? The multiplicity of theologies, right, in our public discourse. And she mentioned these words, and I think they're very relevant here in this discussion. And she was reflecting on some aspects of our current moment. And she said, one of the things that we've got to deal with is that how is it that we develop a theology or theologies in a technocracy where only a few lives matter? How do we raise people up from disposability to essentiality? And this goes beyond the question of race. What is it that public theology can say to a white person in Massachusetts who is heroin addicted because they feel that their lives have no meaning because of the trickle-down impact of whiteness in the world today? What do you say to someone who has been told that their whole essence is whiteness and power and domination, and when that no longer exists, then they feel like they are dying and they get caught up in the throes of death? And I don't hear any theologies. That's why Donald Trump is essential, because although we don't agree with him, people think that they are speaking to the pain they are feeling. So where are the theologies? I don't hear anyone speaking to the 45-year-old in Appalachia who is dying of an early age because they feel they have been eradicated because whiteness is smaller than it was yesterday. And so she goes on in that way, and it's really amazing. But I want to pose that in this way we think of the role of whiteness, right? White people are also, as folks mentioned, as part of this sort of soul searching that we're in, right? And so John A. Powell, a critical race legal scholar in Berkeley, talks about widening the circles of inclusion, but part of that has to be engaging in critical analysis of what whiteness is and how folks are feeling, how white folks are feeling that loss and are reacting to that loss of identity, right? So. So expanding that.
As we move to the next question, or maybe our owner of panels might like to respond.
Thank you very much. Those are both two really thoughtful comments. I think for me, they also raise the question of speaking in the language of that we're comfortable with, as thinking of the we as academics versus the language of our audience. And I'm thinking here, just to broaden the conversation slightly, about in the earlier this year, the state of Colorado released a tremendous report talking about refugees and the positive economic impact, among other things, that they bring to the state. And that, in particular, the metrics are that if you spend $1 to bring a refugee to Colorado, they produce back $1.22. And this was the person who was speaking about it talked about this as really compelling evidence, and then talked about going around presenting to various constituency groups around Colorado and finding that this wasn't compelling evidence at all to people, because what they felt was that it was still a bit of an invasion. It was outsiders coming in. And so I think that for those of us who are very used to making evidence-based arguments and to trying persuading by fact, to think about the reality of emotion and fear and to take that seriously, whether we may agree with it, is also to avoid setting up other people as enemies and to bring them into the community of humans. I think, Sarah, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, in spirit, I really, the material that you were just reading is very powerful. I can't help but feel, and in some of the work that I'm doing on Christian theology and is particularly important, because I think that creative ways to think about how we can all work together in spite of our many differences, and again, in spite of other differences that might keep us at sort of, at odds on certain other issues, and that might not ever result in friendships or whatever. But like, I do think that religious discourse is actually one of the most important, or a very important avenue to pursue. I just wanted to lift that up, that was, I hadn't heard of that scholar, so or activist scholar, and I really appreciate that. So I would look forward to hearing more in your work and IRISE connected up with these things. But I think that in all of the comments, it's really just the question of either demonizing the person who you identify as, let's say, someone who voted opposite from you. That's not going to help us. Well, so again, back to my different buckets. It's fine to demonize Nazis. Like, that's, I mean, again, not everyone would agree with me, but I'm not somebody who is in favor of just trying tirelessly to bring everyone to the table. So with those people out, and with rabid racists out and things like that, let's just talk about people on different sides of different fences or different kind of overall views. If there's somebody who is white and who is afraid of what's going on, that's the person I'm now speaking of, who's not sort of marching with a hood, but the person who's scared and who doesn't want to, who is scared when they hear about the caravan language and et cetera. The question is, we currently, and just to identify as a bit of, let's say, on the more left, as someone who is critical of my liberalism in the following way, like whether liberal, progressive, et cetera, views tend to have a very aggressive proselytizing campaign that's very similar to the kind of proselytizing that people on the left find to be unnerving around, let's say, evangelicals, or let's say certain kind of proselytizing groups on the right. In other words, liberals and progressives, I think, tend to have a sense that what to do with that person who's a white person in the middle of the country who's fearful is to just get them to recognize that the views on the left are the correct ones. And I don't just think that's a practical problem. I think that's an ethical problem. And so, all that said, there's a delicate balance here. Is it me again? All right, I'm gonna wrap up. I'm getting a cosmic set of signals here that I should, I don't know, again, can be interpreted however I want. So I'll be working now on that additional one. But there's something, there's a paradox and a complexity that we need to think more clearly about. One is, and working with many on the panel here over the years with these fine colleagues, as well as other colleagues with whom we work, in this new religious inclusivity initiative that Andrea, myself, and others are really been working to roll out this winter, the op-ed that we wrote with Nader, and all the work that we do with Tom, with IRISE and the postdocs. We're all about the idea and the importance of the idea that we need to educate people more about religions and educate people more about different perspectives so that people can give up some of their fear. On the other hand, we also have to be careful not to secretly try to convert everyone to be me. And I don't know how to manage that, but I do feel that we don't talk about that. So if more of us start thinking about that, I think we would have at least some places to start to get a little bit more creative.
I just want to say very quickly in response to the two questions that were at the top, that we're not going to get out of this deep crisis unless we can do what both of you sort of suggested. Try to understand, try to listen to those people on the other side of the barricades who are sympathetic or supportive of Donald Trump. To dismiss them entirely as being a band of racists and bigots doesn't help us. One, because it's not factually accurate. And there are legitimate grievances. There is legitimate pain. I think Donald Trump in many ways is the catalyst for a lot of this rising tide of hatred. But the deeper question is, how do we explain how a lot of good people, decent people, have rallied to the altar of this con artist and habitual liar? I mean, how did we get to a point in this country where Donald Trump fluctuates between 40 and 45%? There are deeper economic, social, political anxieties that are at the root of this crisis that this country is facing that we have to address. There's no magic wand that one can wave to address them all, but I think part of the way we figure ourselves out of this huge political dilemma that is really threatening the future of democracy in this country is really to try and listen to, in whatever way we can, those people on the other side who do have, I think, legitimate stories, grievances to tell, and that has to be part of the solution.
I think, Dr. Hashemi, you're right. But if we go back a little, there's the German Methodist minister who said, first they came for the Unionists, then they came for the Jews, and they came for the Gypsies, and now they're coming for me, and there's nobody else to save me. And I think, a lot of people have a lot of fears, and I've gotten the sense to try to fight fire with fire, I don't think really makes a lot of sense. I think we need to understand that what's been happening in a lot of respects in the world and in this country is that the rate of change has been going on and is accelerating. And so what it boils down to is there are a lot of people who are not able to cope with the rate of change that's been going on globally and in this country, and they're hurting. And if you think about where the Democrats are right now, they're talking about everybody's worried about health care. Well, everybody's worried about health care because they're worried about something for themselves, and they're very worried about the downsides that they may face. So I think what we need to do is to try to band together and understand what the real values in this country are. And there was an article in the New York Times this morning comparing, it was a generalization, Republicans to Democrats, and it was talking about whether it's about flag waving or whether it's about the national anthem or whether it's really about the values. And I think, what's great about America and what we've got to keep up is the values of America, and then taking those values, band around those values, and try to get other people to understand how important those values are to them in meeting their fears.
I try to make this into a question, but it may end up being more comments, more commentary. I'm trying to really thread a needle here between what we're talking about in terms of listening to whiteness, and I think that unpacking what whiteness means is crucial. But also, I'm tempted by a rather lovely special on CNN, the words of a special on CNN, that he's a comedian, but he went because it was W. Kamau Bell, and it was United Shades of America, and he went to talk to this Klansman fellow. And not that, again, that's bucket 2. So there is a certain level of that as well, but I think that this is probably a fear that goes beyond this. He said that he was desperately afraid that white folks would not have a town to control, and Bell turned to him and said, but wait, whites are the controlling force of 80% of this country, if not perhaps more, in terms of numbers of towns. And so it occurs to me as though the claim that he's making of losing whiteness is a rather odd one, but I'm wondering whether or not there's something underneath it that isn't about whiteness at all, but is about something. So, and that seems to be worth discussing. The topic of whether or not it's, we need to lean into whiteness, I think is an entirely different topic, and one I'm relatively uncomfortable with dredging back up, because I don't think it really gets us very far. But if we can figure out what's underneath that concern and fear, that seems like a better charge. But I'm not sure really how to really dig at that, because I don't know what the fear is. It's probably economic, I would assume.
One comment on that. So, I mean, again, that tension that you're pointing to, it's sort of related to the question then in terms of strategies of the importance of providing knowledge and of providing opportunities for learning, because presumably some fears, maybe most fears, are going to potentially be maneuvered or removed if people have a robust conversation, right, where it's like, oh, wow, it turns out that most places are white, so maybe I don't need, like, whether it's geographical information or whether it's religious information or whether it's information and the thing that we do and research and provide opportunities for learning has to be part of the equation. On the other hand, as you're astutely sort of pointing to, which is the thing that exactly that we also need to worry about, is are there underlying things, whether call them hatreds or whatever. I mean, so we could talk about two kinds of hatreds, and are there two or more kinds? One kind is dispelled by knowledge, but maybe the other kind isn't. So my concern, for example, is, and again, I hope we take seriously the kind of hatred that is dispelled by knowledge, otherwise I'm out of a job. I mean, that's most, right, we hope that that's one of the big contributions. But the truth is that there is another possible kind of hatred that I'm not sure is addressed by knowledge, and to make it even more sort of arresting, it could actually, if you push knowledge into it, that kind of hatred, it might consume that knowledge and turn it into even more hatred. So for example, this killer with the synagogue, he knows more about Judaism than I do, because I never heard of CAHSS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. He knows about CAHSS. I honestly, you know, it took me a moment aback. I'm like, oh, he just needs to know more about Judaism. Actually, he knows a lot about, I mean, he knows socially about a group that I never heard of. He also knows theologically about Judaism, and that part I do know, so he only knows a few more things, maybe, you know. But I also, with me, he knows the thing that I spend my time dedicated to studying about Judaism, which is the relationship between Judaism and helping the poor and helping immigrants. So here's a man who knows more than I do about Judaism, or at least some extra stuff, and that's actually not just dispelling his hatred, it's fueling it. So I just want to, I mean, that's a very upsetting sort of point, but it speaks to what you're saying, that we have to wrestle with both. We have to figure out what are the kinds of hatred that are fixed by knowledge, and what are the kinds of hatred that are both either not fixed by knowledge or actually fueled by knowledge. And that's it's a very unfortunate fact that we need to wrestle with. And the second kind then needs to be addressed in some other way, and I don't know what that way is.
Thanks. I don't know if I need this, but I'll use it anyway. So obviously I work pretty closely with three of you, and I know only one of you is a political scientist, but I figured I'd ask this anyway, because I haven't heard anyone really talk about sort of projecting the future outside of a potentially very negative future, which I also do fear, by the way. So, and I do understand there could be counter arguments to the question I'm going to ask. You could talk about economic displacement, and that a lot of this is among younger people as well. But what if I were to say to you that many people who voted for Donald Trump and hold a lot of these ideas, they're baby boomers, they're older. They grew up in a much whiter society during a time in which immigration restrictions were firmly in place in the United States, and I don't know how else to put this population will naturally go away over the next 30 years. So my question is what we're seeing sort of a last stand, or do you project it being potentially something that will continue in the future, even as in 30 years there are only members of Generation X, Millennials, Gen Z, and whatever generation comes after that?
Thanks, Jonathan, for the somewhat positive, optimistic sort of My own reading of what's happening is that a lot of the anxiety is economic at its root, and so as long as that economic anxiety exists, it's not necessarily a question of older baby boomers that are responsible for this problem. As long as the economic anxiety and the frustration is there, then a demagogue or some politician like Donald Trump can exploit it. So as long as that exists, as long as there's a sense that, look, the political system is broken, the economic system is broken, then I think we're still in the same dilemma. So I think that's the counter sort of argument perhaps to your response. And I think this is something that we're seeing in other countries that are subject to rising authoritarianism, right? There is a broader base of support than simply older people who remember a more, a whiter society. There's something to what you're saying, but I think, the problem is much, I think, deeper than that, and I think we have to be addressing those aspects of the problem.
Very quickly, Jonathan, you'll appreciate this. We as historians are notoriously poor predictors of the future, right? So with that caveat, I mean, I think as we look back to history, right, we have seen these moments, or at least echoes of these moments, right? The anxious aggrandizement of the mid-19th century, right? The rise of xenophobia, the Know-Nothing Party. And one of the things I think that it'll be interesting to see in the upcoming years is a reinvigoration of local democracy. Those political scientists that have been following what's been happening know that this is a project that began in the 1960s, right? And it's a project that began in the 1960s about destabilizing government, right? And big government. And government's bad, and government's evil, and government takes your taxes. And it's a project that began at the national level, but then was reduced to the local level, right? And it was the idea of taking over school boards and water boards and city councils, and then going to state government and taking over governorships. And of course, having a very clear idea of how power works. I think what's interesting about this moment, for at least from as I've been following it as not one who's trained in political science, but knows a little bit about political history, is if this is a moment where new forms to power based upon local government can be seized, can be taken, but it's going to be a project that's going to happen for another generation, right? Another 40 years.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. This has been extremely stimulating and sobering at the same time. Yeah, my question kind of cuts across a lot of comments, actually, and it's a comment itself. And I'm curious to sort of move the register of active resistance in terms of affect theory rather than language, right? Like, so in terms of like constituting the civil public space in which we cohabit uncertainty with people of difference, people with different views, whatever. I loved your comment, Dr. Pessin. We may not see eye to eye, but we can stand in arms kind of thing. And not to sort of use this militarized metaphor, but to suggest that I don't think it can come down just to like an exchange of words. And I loved your comment too, actually, Dr. Stanton, that changing words we use about changing hearts and minds. And to the extent that we can change people's minds and hearts on that level, I'm curious to gesture towards this gentleman's comment too, that it's not just whiteness, there's something seething beneath this existential angst, and making recourse too to theology in that comment. And for me, there's a poverty of a language of the heart in my mind, to create a space where you can actually listen without judgment, without projecting over and onto the other person before you actually hear what they're saying. So I'm kind of curious to explore like what it might mean to mobilize strategies that help to enlist ourselves as responsible citizens in a project, right? A civil project that affirms difference rather than negates it. How do we address fear at this level of sort of embodied practice?
Adam, that was an amazing bringing together of almost everything everyone said. That was very well done. Adam is a PhD student with us, so I'd like to show him off as a synthesizer. I think what you also, so affect theory, to put really crudely and give a super cheap version, is kind of feelings before we get into language. And so I think that also gets at some of, maybe some of what makes me a little nervous about Jonathan's comment, and aside from the idea of we just wait for people to die and then things will get better, but which is that I'm not sure. I think again that as academics we tend to look for things that are quantifiable or analyzable, like economic status or ideological commitment. And I just think that maybe we don't want to use affect theory, but the notion of what does it mean to be economically insecure? It means that you're not sure that you can provide for your children and you love them. It means that you're not sure about your parents and you love them. And so I think that there's something in that that is more than just the rational actor or semi-rational actor theory. And so I think you're getting to that too. In terms of responsible citizenship, as some of you know, I have young children. And so try and give them a whole spectrum of books and other things. And it seems to me that a lot of the way that diversity in the United States is portrayed is at the level of pictures. And so it is a white person, a dark-skinned person, another dark-skinned person, a person in an ethnic dress, a person in another ethnic dress. And it's very pretty. And it diversifies the picture, but that doesn't necessarily address the questions of comfort or, as you say, uncertainty. And so in my head, I'm trying to think of what does it mean to go beyond that? What does it mean to live with the expectation and the readiness to embrace difference and the readiness to be displaced in your own sense of self by difference, and to think of that as a positive part of Americanness and not a negative part of Americanness.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for being late. I was at a meeting with a group of impressive students who were presenting some demands to the leadership of this institution around how to make a particular unit here a little more inclusive. And so I thought I would first thank the panelists for their wisdom and expertise and for providing a space for us to process what has been happening in the world, in our nation. Last week, my parents were in Kentucky, and I got a call from them. And the story my mom relayed to me was that right around the time the murders happened in Kroger, they were in a Kroger about 15 miles away. So it was something that hit close to home, and a reminder that these days there is indeed a rising amount of hatred in the world. I think the comments that I caught, and so it's the last 35 minutes or so, and were appropriately framed in what was happening in the world and in the nation. And I want to close by bringing it home to campus. Because I think we don't want to ignore the fact that the tides that we are focused on today are also appearing here in this institution, in the places where folks are supposed to come to learn. And so I've appreciated the focus on knowledge. So that is the framing of this. The rally on Friday, how many of you had a chance to witness that and experience that? Okay. So I think the rally on Friday and the session today provide some examples of what we can do to stem rising tides of hate. I thought about just being out on the green and in this meeting today, how truly blessed I was to experience such exceptional student leaders who, in the midst of all their pain and suffering, found grace in their hearts to offer us what my dear friend Bianca Williams refers to as their radical honesty. Their truth-telling, which authentically captured the ways in which this institution has once again been complicit in our false promise of inclusive excellence, neglectful in failing to protect and care for some of our communities that are most vulnerable, and short-sighted in initially not recognizing that though these recent hateful attacks on our humanity are highly problematic, it is the institution, not just the recent perpetrators of violence, who need to step up and be accountable. These brave students model for us what we need to do to stem this rising tide of hate is not fight expressions of hate with words of affirmation and love, for they know all too well that fake love, like the happy talk of diversity, cannot serve as a buffer to the daily doses of microaggressions and micro-invalidations that serve as a daily reminder that they are a guest in somebody else's house. These amazing students call for accountability and action as their counter-narratives to the false promises of diversity and inclusion. And it serves as a powerful reminder that what we need to stem this tide of hate is bold leadership and praxis that has no fear, that does not waver in its commitment to equity, and definitely does not compromise its espoused values when confronted with pushback from other folks. The courage that these students displayed was inspiring and compelling, and a reminder that it's much harder for hate to hit its targets when those who are often relegated to the margins disrupt the expectation that they are supposed to be here and be quiet, and instead face that hate and come together in support of each other. In doing so, they gave us a solid blueprint for what we need to do. Be bold in our leadership and praxis. Have no fear. Move beyond words of affirmation and love to consistent behaviors that exemplify real action and accountability that gives us a chance to collectively move away from the happy talk of inclusive excellence and 1DU and become a campus community that allows everyone, regardless of their prior lived experiences, regardless of their current positionality in the world, to have a powerful sense of belonging. Thank you, and thank you to the panelists.